In 1962, a black man from Georgia and a white man from Tennessee walked into the same room in Memphis. And the music industry has never been the same since. But what nobody talks about is what almost kept them from ever meeting at all. And the single moment in that recording studio that made Steve Cropper put down his coffee, walk to the glass, and stare in complete silence. It was an October afternoon in Memphis, Tennessee, and the air smelled like motor oil and barbecue smoke drifting up from the street below. The building on East McLemore Avenue did not look like the kind of place where history gets made. It was a converted movie theater with a plain brick facade, bad lighting in the hallways, and a parking lot full of cracks. The sign out front read Stax Records. Inside, however, something extraordinary was already happening. Black musicians and white musicians were playing together in the same room at a time when the American South made that kind of thing feel dangerous. Jim Crow was not a set of laws anymore. It was the air people breathed. It was in the restaurants that would not seat you and the water fountains that bore your name like a warning. And yet inside this converted movie theater on a cracked street in Memphis, none of that existed. There was only music. Steve Cropper had been part of Stax Records almost from the beginning. He was born in Dora, Missouri in 1941 and grew up in Memphis, a white kid who fell in love with the rhythm and blues records his black neighbors played on weekends. He taught himself guitar by listening to those records through walls and open windows. He was not supposed to love that music. The culture around him told him it was not his music, not his world, not his place. But Steve Cropper never cared much about what he was supposed to do. By the time he was a teenager, he could play guitar with a feel that most grown men spent decades chasing. He joined a band called the Royal Spades, which eventually became the Marquis, and that band eventually became the house band at Stax Records, known to the world as Booker T and the MGs. Steve Cropper, a white boy from Missouri, was the guitarist for the greatest soul music house band in American history. And on that October afternoon in 1962, he was sitting in the control room at Stax with a cup of coffee and a legal pad full of chord charts, listening to a recording session that was not going particularly well. The session that day was for a guitarist named Johnny Jenkins. Yes, Jenkins was a local talent with real skill, but the energy in the room was flat. The chemistry was not there. The songs were not landing. Jim Stewart, the co-founder of Stax Records, kept stopping the tape and starting over, his face tight with the particular frustration of a man watching studio time turn into wasted money. Nobody in that room knew that a miracle was sitting in the parking lot. Otis Redding had driven Johnny Jenkins to the session because Jenkins did not have a driver's license. That was the entire reason Otis was there. He was the driver. He was 20 years old, born in Dawson, Georgia, raised in Macon, Georgia, the son of a man who preached on Sundays and worked as a laborer during the week until tuberculosis hollowed him out from the inside and left him gasping for air in a hospital bed. Otis had dropped out of Ballard Hudson High School at 15 years old to dig wells and pump gas and haul bricks in the Georgia heat, anything that would put food on the table for his family. He had won a local talent show 15 weeks in a row, taking home $5 each time, until the organizers told him he was not allowed to compete anymore because it was not fair to the other contestants. He had been singing his entire life, in church choirs, on porches, in the back seats of cars driving down Georgia highways at 2 in the morning. But he had no recording contract. He had no manager. He had no connections. He had a voice and a hunger, so deep it had its own gravity. When the Jenkins session stalled out and there were 40 minutes of studio time left, someone looked at Otis sitting in the corner of the room and asked if he wanted to try something. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. Otis walked to the microphone. He stood there for a moment, collecting himself, and then he began to sing a song he had written called "These Arms of Mine." It was a ballad, slow and aching, built from the simplest possible materials. A few chords, a melody that moved like a man walking through deep water, and a voice that cracked on the very first note, not from nervousness, but from something that lived underneath nervousness, something raw and wounded and desperately alive. The sound of a person who had been carrying pain for so long that it had become music. Steve Cropper was in the control room when it happened. He had been doing this long enough to know what a good singer sounded like. He had worked with talented people. He had heard voices that impressed him and voices that moved him. But what came through those studio monitors when Otis Redding opened his mouth was something different. It was not impressive. Impressive was the wrong word entirely. It was true. Steve Cropper set down his coffee cup on the console and stood up slowly and walked to the glass and stared. He did not say anything. He did not write anything on his legal pad. He just stood there and listened, and later he would say that in that moment, he understood something he had not understood before about what music could actually do to a person. Jim Stewart signed Otis Redding to Stax Records before the session was over. What followed over the next 5 years was one of the most remarkable creative partnerships in the history of American music. Steve Cropper and Otis Redding were not supposed to make sense together. One was white, one was black. One had grown up in relative comfort. One had grown up counting grains of rice. One had been formally educated in music. One had learned everything he knew from church choirs and $5 talent shows. They came from different worlds, different cultures, different versions of the same country. But when they sat down together in Studio A at Stax Records, none of that geography mattered. What mattered was the music. They wrote together in a way that felt less like collaboration and more like conversation. Otis would come in with a feeling, a melody, a fragment of something emotional that he could not yet put into words, and Steve would listen and then translate. He understood instinctively what Otis was reaching for. He could hear the shape of a song inside a single hummed phrase. And Otis trusted him completely, which was not a small thing for a man who had spent his entire life in a country that gave him very few reasons to trust anyone who looked like Steve Cropper. They wrote Mr. Pitiful together in 15 minutes. They wrote I Have Been Loving You too long together on a tour bus in the middle of the night, passing a notebook back and forth while the highway lights strobed through the windows. They wrote Fa 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 Fa, which is also known as the sad song, as a joke that turned into a hit. And they wrote Respect, the song that Otis built from a simple idea about a working man coming home and asking for something the world never gave him easily. When Aretha Franklin recorded her own version of Respect in 1967 and took it to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, Otis Redding laughed and told people that a girl had stolen his song. There was no bitterness in his voice when he said it, only pride. Steve Cropper was the architect. Otis Redding was the fire. The architecture gave the fire a shape, and the fire made the architecture breathe. Separately, they were both remarkable. Together, they were something that happened once in a generation, if that. But the partnership was built on more than talent. It was built on a kind of mutual recognition that cut through every barrier the world had erected between them. Steve Cropper saw in Otis Redding a man who carried something inside him that could not be taught, could not be rehearsed, could not be manufactured in any studio anywhere in the world. And Otis Redding saw in Steve Cropper a man who listened without judgment, who heard music the way Otis heard music, as something that existed between people rather than inside them. In a city that was still fighting over which water fountain belonged to whom, these two men built something that belonged to everyone. By 1967, Otis Redding was on the edge of becoming the biggest crossover artist in American history. His performance at the Monterey International Pop Festival in June of that year had converted 50,000 white rock fans in a single afternoon. The walls that had kept soul music penned inside black audiences were cracking. The entire music industry could feel what was coming, and Steve Cropper was right there with him, at the guitar, in the studio, writing songs that kept getting better and stranger and deeper. On December 7th of 1967, Otis walked into Stax Studios and told Steve Cropper he had a song that was going to be his first #1 single. He had been carrying the melody for months, writing fragments of lyrics on hotel stationery and paper napkins, building something quieter and more reflective than anything he had ever recorded before. They sat down together and finished it in 30 minutes. When Otis could not remember what he wanted to say at the end of the song, he just whistled. A soft, wandering, melancholy whistle that trailed off into silence. Steve Cropper told him they would fix it when he came back. Otis said he had a little fade-out idea and they would sort it out later. He never came back. 3 days later, on December 10th of 1967, Otis Redding's plane went down into the frozen water of Lake Monona in Wisconsin, 4 miles from the runway in Madison. He was 26 years old. Steve Cropper got the call and could not speak for a long time afterward. He went into the studio alone and mixed the final version of the song, adding the sound of seagulls and crashing waves, the sounds Otis had told him he wanted on the track. The whistle stayed. There was no one left to finish it. Sitting on the dock of the bay was released on January 8th of 1968 and went straight to the top of the Billboard Hot 100. It became the first posthumous #1 single in the history of American music. And that whistle, that accidental, unrepeatable, heartbreaking whistle, became the most famous few seconds of silence in soul music history. Steve Cropper has spent more than 50 years being asked about Otis Redding. He answers every time. He never gets tired of it. He has said that working with Otis was the most important creative experience of his life, not because of the hits, not because of the legacy, but because of what it taught him about what music is actually for. Music is not for impressing people, Cropper has said. Music is for telling the truth. And Otis Redding was the most truthful singer Steve Cropper ever heard. There is a studio in Memphis that still stands on East McLemore Avenue. The building has been a museum for years now. Tourists walk through the same rooms where Otis Redding once stood at a microphone and changed the world. They look at the old equipment and the photographs on the walls, and they try to imagine what it sounded like. But you cannot imagine it. You can only listen. Pull up these arms of mine right now and press play. Close your eyes. That is what Steve Cropper heard through the glass on an October afternoon in 1962. That is what made him put down his coffee and walk to the window and stare. Some sounds do not need an explanation. They just need someone willing to stand still and listen. If this story moved you, if the partnership between a white guitar player from Tennessee and a black singer from Georgia reminded you that the greatest things in human history are built across the lines that divide us, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us what Otis Redding's music means to you. Every comment, every share, every subscription is how these stories reach people who have never heard them. Ring the notification bell so you never miss another story about the voices that changed music forever, because these stories deserve to be told, and you deserve to know them.